Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
In this video lesson, I'm going to go over a test I recently gave my Year 1 IB Economics students. These questions are original questions written by me, but each of them tests a very key concept from our Unit 1.1 in the IB Economics course, which is on supply, demand, and equilibrium. Let's start with question number 1, which says, state the law of demand and distinguish between a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. Include a diagram to illustrate your explanation. Let's start out with the simple definition of the law of demand. The law of demand states that there is an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity consumers demand of that good. Ceteris paribus. Now, the ceteris paribus is an important part of our definition of the law of demand here. Ceteris paribus means all else equal. This is assuming that nothing else changes. If only the price of a good changes, then the quantity demand will change in the opposite direction, always. As prices rise, the quantity demanded by consumers will fall, and as prices fall, the quantity demanded by consumers will rise. So the next part of the question says, distinguish between a movement along a demand curve and a shift in a demand curve. For this, we're going to need to draw a demand diagram, which shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. A demand curve, reflecting the inverse relationship between price and quantity, is always downward sloping. In order to answer this question using a diagram, it would be helpful to plot a couple of points on this demand curve, which I'll do, and I'll call these points A and B. Each of these points corresponds with the price and quantity combination. We'll call this P1 and this P2, Q1 and Q2. Now, if the price of a good were to fall from P1 to P2, notice that the demand does not change for this good, rather the quantity that consumers demand changes. So a movement along a demand curve results from a change in price. That helps answer the first part of this question that says, distinguish between a movement along a demand curve and a shift in the demand curve. So to answer the second part, we must actually draw a new demand curve. Assume that the demand for this product shifts to the right, to D1. I'll draw an arrow to indicate that the demand has increased. Now, what can cause a shift in a demand curve? Now, a shift in a demand curve may result from a change in a non-price determinant of demand. An example of a non-price determinant demand might be the tastes of consumers, the prices of related goods, incomes of consumers, the expectations of consumers of future prices or future incomes, and so on. If any of these factors besides the price of the good changes, then the demand for a good can either increase, which is illustrated as a shift to the right. This is an increase in demand. Or demand could alternatively decrease to, let's say, D2. A leftward shift of demand illustrates a decrease in demand. So demand increasing or decreasing basically means that at each of the prices on a demand curve, either a greater quantity, as we see here, I'll call this point X, and we'll call this Q3, will be demanded if demand increases, or at a particular price, a lower quantity will be demanded if demand decreases. So we have now distinguished between a movement along a demand curve, which is caused solely by a change in the price of a good, and a shift in a demand curve, which can be the result of a change in a non-price determinant, such as the tastes of consumers, the prices of related goods, the incomes of consumers, or the expectations of consumers. So pause the video, look over my answer to this first question before we move on to the next question. Okay, let's now move on to the next question on this test. The second question said, using a particular good as an example, identify and explain the effect of a change in three non-price determinants of demand on the equilibrium, price, and the quantity for the good. So this question asks us to consider not just the effect on the demand for a particular good, but actually on the equilibrium price in the quantity. In order to show the equilibrium price and quantity for a good, we must consider both the demand for that good and the supply of that good. The equilibrium price of a good is found at the intersection of demand and supply. Now, although this question does not ask for a graph, I'm going to draw one just to illustrate the effect on equilibrium price and quantity of changes in the determinants of demand for a particular good. So the good I'm going to consider is ice cream. Let's consider three non-price determinants of demand for ice cream. The first one is going to be the price of a related good, and the related good I'm going to consider is frozen yogurt. Frozen yogurt is a substitute for ice cream. It can be eaten instead of ice cream. If the price of frozen yogurt, let's say, decreases, so the price of frozen yogurt decreases, this will lead to a decrease in demand for ice cream. Consumers will choose to consume more frozen yogurt and less ice cream. So the result will be a leftward shift of the demand curve for ice cream to D1. Demand will decrease, but importantly, we must point out that this will lead to a lower price for ice cream as the price falls to P1 and a reduced quantity supplied of ice cream as producers respond to the lower demand by cutting back on their output of ice cream and lowering the price. So as the price of frozen yogurt decreases, the demand for ice cream decreases, which leads to the price of ice cream falling and the quantity of ice cream falling. So that's a complete answer to this question. One of the determinants of demand for ice cream is the price of related goods. Now, there could be other circumstances that would lead to an increase or a decrease in the demand for ice cream. For example, what if there is abnormally cold weather? Ice cream is a product that is consumed seasonally. When the weather is abnormally cold, we would expect the demand for ice cream to decrease as well. Now, the outcome of this decrease in demand for ice cream would be the same as the effect of a decrease in the price of frozen yogurt. The equilibrium price would fall and the equilibrium quantity would decrease. As ice cream becomes less demanded by consumers, firms will lower their prices and reduce the quantity that they supply. A third determinant of demand for ice cream might be the incomes of consumers. Let's assume that consumers' incomes rise. An increase in consumers' incomes, assuming ice cream is a normal good, in other words, a good for which there is a direct relationship between incomes and demand, will lead to an increase in the demand for ice cream, which, let's show the effect of that increase in demand on our demand and supply diagram here. Assume ice cream demand grows to D2. Ice cream now becomes more scarce, therefore producers supply a greater quantity and they charge a higher price of P2. So the increase in demand will lead to a higher price for ice cream and a greater quantity for ice cream. So I've just gone through three non-price determinants of demand for ice cream. The price of frozen yogurt, a substitute for ice cream, is directly related to the demand for ice cream. As frozen yogurt prices fall, ice cream demand falls, causing the price of ice cream and the quantity of ice cream to fall. Cold weather, this describes a special circumstance which might lead to a decrease in demand for ice cream, also leading to a lower price and quantity. Assuming ice cream is a normal good, an increase in consumers' income will cause demand to grow, leading producers to charge a higher price and produce a greater quantity. So that's an answer to the second question on this test. Let's scroll down and look at the third question. This is where many students had a really hard time on this test in my class. This question asks us to consider the effect that an increase in the price of petrol is likely to have on three markets. Firstly, the effect of an increase in the price of petrol on the market for petrol itself. Now we are asked to use a diagram for each of these answers, so I'm going to sketch three different diagrams, one for each of the markets that we are illustrating the effect on. So let's start with the market diagram for petrol. Now again, a market diagram must include both a demand curve and a supply curve for a good, since a market is where buyers and sellers meet. We'll start with an equilibrium price of PE and an equilibrium quantity of QE. Don't forget to add all of your labels to a graph as well. In order to get full points on an economics test, when drawing diagrams, you must have complete labels: supply, demand, quantity, price, equilibrium points, as well as, most of the time, a title. So this is the petrol market. So the question asks us to consider the effect of an increase in the price of petrol on the market for petrol itself. So let's assume that for some reason the price of petrol rises to P1. What impact will this higher price have on the market for petrol? First, let's draw a dotted line across and see how demand and supply are affected. At a higher price, fewer consumers will demand petrol. So we can see that the quantity demanded for petrol will decrease. However, more producers will wish to provide petrol since there are greater profits to be earned in the petrol market now. So the quantity supplied, we go all the way out to our supply curve, draw a dotted line down, and we'll see that the quantity supplied increases. So the impact of the higher price of petrol is a decrease in the quantity demanded and an increase in the quantity supplied. Now, anytime there is a quantity supplied that is greater than the quantity demanded, we say there is a surplus of the good. In this case, there is excess supply of petrol resulting from the increase in the price from PE to P1. Now, assuming nothing else changed, assuming there was no change to the level of demand or the level of supply, notice that the supply and demand curves do not shift, then there is no change to the equilibrium price of petrol or the equilibrium quantity. Rather, this market moves from equilibrium at PE and QE to a disequilibrium at P1, at which the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So this question caught a lot of students off guard. It's very simple. There is a direct relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied, and an indirect relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. So as the price rises, QD falls and QS increases, resulting in a disequilibrium. However, the equilibrium price and quantity do not change as a result of this increase in price. Now let's move on to the next part of this question, part B, which is now identified as part A here. We are now asked to explain, with the help of a diagram, the effect of an increase in the price of petrol on the equilibrium price and quantity of automobiles in the market for automobiles. So once again, we're considering a different market now. We're going to draw our axes, label P and Q, and we'll draw our demand curve and our supply curve for automobiles. Don't forget those labels, supply, demand, and let's start off by labeling our original equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Now what we must consider is the relationship, we got to give this graph a name too, the relationship between petrol and cars. How are these goods related? From an economic standpoint, these two goods are complementary goods, meaning that they are used in conjunction with one another. You cannot drive a car without petrol. Anybody who wants to drive a car must put petrol in that car. So what happens when the price of petrol increases? Well, the relationship between the price of a complementary good and the demand for a good is an inverse relationship. As petrol prices rise, the demand for autos will decrease. Let's illustrate that on our graph. Fewer people will wish to drive cars as they become more and more costly to drive due to the rising petrol prices. Therefore, demand for autos will shift to the left, and this will have a negative effect on the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price of automobiles. So I'm going to show the price falling to P1 and the quantity falling to P1. And I will explain over here that the decrease in demand for automobiles causes the price to fall, the equilibrium price to fall, the equilibrium quantity to fall as well. The quantity supplied of automobiles is directly related to the price. As consumers demand fewer cars, the prices of cars fall, and producers respond by reducing the quantity that they supply. So the determinant of demand at play here is the price of related goods. And the way petrol and cars are related is that they are complements for one another. Thirdly, we are asked to explain with the help of a diagram the effect that an increase in the price of petrol will have on the equilibrium price and quantity of biodiesel, which we are told is a substitute for petrol. So this is a similar problem to the second part of this question, except now instead of considering the effect of an increase in the price of petrol on a complementary good, we are going to consider the effect of higher petrol prices on a substitute for petrol, biodiesel. So we'll start once again, as we always do, with a market in equilibrium with a supply curve, a demand curve, an equilibrium price, and an equilibrium quantity. We'll give our graph a title. This is now biodiesel. So consider the impact of an increase in the price of petrol. These two goods are now substitutes for each other. As petrol prices rise, how will consumers respond in the market for biodiesel? Assuming biodiesel really is a substitute for petrol, this will lead to an increase in the demand for biodiesel because the price of a substitute has risen. Consumers will voluntarily switch from using petrol in their cars to buying cars and using biodiesel in their cars. So the demand for biodiesel will increase. Let's show the effect of that on our graph. Demand will shift to the right. We'll label this our new demand curve, D1. I'll draw an arrow to indicate the shift. And we can identify the impact that this will have on the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of biodiesel. And that is a positive relationship. So the price of biodiesel will go up and the quantity of biodiesel will go up as well. So the determinant of demand at play here is once again the price of related goods. However, the goods, petrol and biodiesel, are substitutes for each other, unlike petrol and cars, which are complements for each other. The final question on this test asked us to consider the impact of an increase in the price of wheat on two markets. First, we're asked to examine the impact of an increase in the price of wheat on the market for bread. You should know that wheat is an important ingredient in bread. Of course, you can't make bread without wheat. So we're going to start with the market diagram for bread. We'll show the original demand and the original supply of bread and the equilibrium price of bread before the increase in the price of wheat. So how are bread and wheat related? Wheat is a resource used to make bread. It should be clear right away that we are no longer talking about a determinant of demand. Wheat is neither a substitute nor a complement for bread. You don't eat bread and wheat together. Rather, wheat is needed to make bread. Therefore, as wheat prices rise, the costs of producing bread increase, and the costs of production are primarily a determinant of supply, not demand. So what we're going to see is that as wheat prices rise, this will lead to higher costs to bakers. As the costs of producing bread increase, we'll actually see the supply of bread decrease. Let's illustrate the effect of a decrease in the supply of bread. Supply will decrease to S1. I'll draw an arrow to indicate the shift. And this will have a negative impact on the quantity of bread, and the price of bread will rise. So as the price of bread rises because of the increasing cost of production, consumers will demand a lesser quantity. We see the quantity demanded falls as we move along the demand curve here. So to complete our answer to this question, we must say that the decrease in the supply of bread causes the price of bread to rise and the quantity of bread to fall. So the relationship here is that wheat is an input or a resource used to produce bread. Wheat prices are a determinant of supply for bread, not a determinant of demand for bread. The final question on this test asked us to consider the impact of an increase in the price of wheat on the market for corn, which, as the question explains, is a crop that farmers can grow instead of wheat. Once again, there was a hint there indicating that this is probably going to impact the supply of corn, not the demand for corn. So in our corn market, we'll start with an original supply curve and an original demand curve with our original equilibrium price and our original equilibrium quantity. Now, as the price of wheat rises, let's go over here. As wheat prices rise, how will this affect the supply or the demand for corn? Is corn a substitute in consumption for wheat? You can't make most of the things you need wheat for using corn. In fact, you wouldn't eat corn instead of wheat either. It's simply not a substitute in consumption. What about a complement? Do wheat and corn, are they used together by consumers? Not necessarily. They're completely different products used for different types of food items. However, if you were a farmer You could grow corn or wheat on the land that you have available. And if the price of wheat goes up, farmers will allocate more land to wheat. This is the law of supply. As wheat prices rise, the quantity supplied of wheat will increase. But in order to increase their production of wheat, they must take land out of corn production and put it into wheat production. This leads to a decrease in the supply of corn. Less corn will be grown when wheat prices rise. Farmers will prefer to grow wheat instead of corn, since these are substitutes in production for one another. The question gave you a clue when it said that farmers can grow corn instead of wheat, implying that they can also grow wheat instead of corn. So the impact of rising wheat prices will be a decrease in the supply of corn available as farmers allocate more land to wheat production. So the reduced supply of corn will cause the equilibrium quantity of corn in the market to decrease. Corn has now become more scarce, so the equilibrium price increases. And that's the final outcome of the increase in the price of wheat. The price of corn will go up as it becomes more scarce, and the quantity of corn will go down. So this last question gave us two examples of how resource costs change, and therefore the supply of particular goods change as a result. Whereas the previous question was all about determinants of demand, in the case of complementary goods, substitute goods, and the good itself, petrol. So now you can go back and rewatch this video if you need to. If you're one of my students, you can compare your own answers to these questions on your test to the ones provided in this video to help you understand better what kind of changes will result from each of the scenarios described here.